The dust of late summer always carried whispers in the small town. It carried the sound of boots on dry boards, the creak of wagon wheels, the tired sigh of cattle in the distance. Folks lived close to the land, close to one another, and even closer to gossip. In such a place, a person's name was as heavy as iron. If someone stamped a word on you, it stuck, whether true or not. For Mary Ellen, that word was infertile. It had been pressed onto her like a brand she never asked for. She was the second daughter of a family that prized strong sons and fertile women. And when years passed without her taking a husband or raising children, whispers grew. It didn't matter that she had never even been married, never truly had the chance to try for children. The town and her own kin decided the story for her. Poor Mary Ellen, they'd mutter, shaking their heads like she was already half dead. Sweet enough but barren. No man wants that. Her mother, worn by years of hardship, sighed whenever Mary Ellen entered a room, as if her very presence reminded her of a wound. Her father, sharp-tongued and quick with his belt, rarely spared her words kinder than useless. Her older brothers teased her mercilessly, calling her a spinster before she'd even reached her 20s. Even her younger sister, Ruth, tossed sly smiles in her direction, knowing she would marry before Mary Ellen ever had a chance. By the time she turned 23, the word had soaked deep into her skin. Folks no longer saw Mary Ellen the woman, they only saw Mary Ellen the infertile. It was Ruth's wedding day that set the cruelest turn. The family house filled with laughter, music, and the smell of roasted meat. Ranch hands and townsfolk danced in the yard while lanterns flickered against the twilight. Mary Ellen moved like a shadow through it all, carrying trays, cleaning spills, making sure her sister's dress never touched the mud. Not one man asked her to dance. Not one man even looked at her. She was a ghost in her own family's celebration. Later, when the whiskey flowed and the laughter grew louder, one of her brothers, Sam, leaned too close to the other men and said loud enough for her to hear, "We ought to send Mary Ellen out to Jedediah Carter's place. Poor rancher hasn't got a woman, and she won't ever bear him no shame with children he'll never get." The men roared with laughter, slapping their knees, nodding like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. Ruth's new husband grinned along. Even her father chuckled, shaking his head. And when the men had their fill of food and whiskey, someone truly did hitch the wagon and haul her things together, shoving them into her arms as though it were a grand jest. "Go on, Mary Ellen," Sam laughed, his eyes mean. "Jedediah's got room for a barren woman. You'll be right at home with his cows." Her mother didn't stop them. Her father didn't stop them. No one spoke for her. She was pushed up into the wagon as though she were nothing more than unwanted baggage. The music behind her grew faint as the horses pulled away. The laughter of her family followed her into the night like a curse. Jedediah Carter lived on a ranch half a day's ride from town. Folks knew him as a hard man, quiet as stone, scarred by years of loss. His wife had died giving birth years ago, and the child had not survived either. Since then, Jedediah kept to his cattle and his land, seldom coming into town except for supplies. He was a man of wide shoulders, tan skin, and eyes that seemed carved from flint. Some said he was cruel. Others said he was lonely, but no one truly knew. When Mary Ellen arrived in the dark, clutching her bundle of clothes, she expected him to turn her away. She expected anger, maybe even violence. But Jedediah simply looked at her with those steady eyes, then at the wagon already rolling back toward town, dust rising like smoke in the moonlight. He asked no questions. He opened his door and stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and leather, of years lived alone. It was tidy, but it bore the silence of a place without laughter. Mary Ellen stood there, trembling, unsure if she had stepped from one cage into another. "You can stay," Jedediah said finally, his voice deep and even. "But I don't need a wife. Don't need company neither. If you're here, you'll work. There's always work." Mary Ellen nodded quickly. Her throat burned, but no tears came. She had learned long ago that tears bought no sympathy. The days that followed were grueling. She rose before dawn, fed the chickens, gathered eggs, swept the porch, and carried water until her arms shook. She cooked meals, mended shirts, milked cows, and tended the small garden. Jedediah spoke little, but he worked beside her, his silence steady and strange. He never mocked her, never raised his hand, never called her barren. He simply let her be. At night, Mary Ellen lay awake on the narrow bed in the small room he gave her, listening to the coyotes howl across the hills. She thought of her family's laughter, of how easily they had cast her aside. She thought of her mother's eyes turned away. Sometimes she pressed her hands against her stomach, empty and flat, and wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe she was cursed. Maybe she truly was nothing. But the land had its own way of shaping a soul. Out there, under the wide sky, among the cattle and the wind, a person learned to stand different. Each day she rose, each task she finished, planted a seed of strength inside her. Jedediah never praised her, but he never dismissed her either. That was more than she had ever known. One evening, while gathering wood near the creek, Mary Ellen heard a faint cry. At first she thought it was a calf lost from its mother, but as she pushed through the brush, her heart stopped. There, wrapped in rags and left beside the water, was a baby, thin, weak, but alive. Her hands shook as she lifted the child. Who could abandon something so small? She pressed the infant against her chest, whispering softly, though she had no idea what to say. She carried the baby back to the cabin, breathless, dirt streaking her dress. Jedediah looked up from the table, his eyes narrowing as she stepped inside with the bundle. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard. "By the creek," she whispered. "Someone left him. Jedediah, he'll die if we don't." She didn't finish, because the baby whimpered again, weak but reaching for life. Jedediah stood slowly, staring at the child as though it were a ghost from his past. For a long moment, the cabin was so silent Mary Ellen thought he might order her to put it back, to leave it. But then Jedediah took a slow breath and said, "Heat some milk. We'll try." That night, under the dim glow of the lantern, Mary Ellen cradled the baby in her arms while Jedediah showed her how to dip a cloth into milk and press it gently against the infant's lips. The baby swallowed in tiny, desperate gulps. Each sound cut into Mary Ellen's heart like a blade. She had never held a child before, and now she clutched one between life and death.
Hours passed. The baby's breathing steadied. His eyes fluttered open, dark and wide, staring up at her as though she were the only safe place in the world. Mary Ellen felt something crack inside her, something that had been locked away all her life. From that night forward, everything changed. The baby, whom she began to call Daniel, became the center of her days. She fed him, bathed him, rocked him to sleep against her chest. Her arms grew strong from carrying him, her voice soft from singing the lullabies she remembered her mother once humming long ago. Jedediah built a small cradle out of oak, setting it by the fire with his rough, steady hands. For the first time, warmth began to seep into the cold corners of the cabin. The townsfolk soon heard whispers of it. Mary Ellen, the Barren girl, living out on Carter's ranch with a child. They didn't know the truth of where Daniel had come from, and they didn't care. They smirked, they sneered, they spun their stories. Some said she had tricked Jedediah into taking her. Others said she had stolen the child. But Mary Ellen did not go into town to hear it. She stayed on the ranch, where the wind could not whisper her shame quite so loud. Yet the day came when she could no longer avoid it. Supplies ran low. Jedediah hitched the wagon and told her to ride along. With Daniel bundled against her chest, they rode into town together. Heads turned the moment they appeared. Her brothers stood on the porch of the general store, their faces twisting into mocking grins. "Well, well," Sam called out. "Looks like our barren sister wasn't so barren after all." The men around him laughed, but Mary Ellen did not bow her head. Not this time. She tightened her arms around the child, her chin lifting as the sun burned down on her face. Jedediah stepped past her, his voice low and steady. "Mind your tongues." Something in his tone made the laughter die. The men shifted uneasily. For once, Mary Ellen did not feel like a shadow. She felt like someone seen. That night, as Daniel slept in his cradle and the fire crackled low, Mary Ellen sat at the table across from Jedediah. She studied his weathered face, the lines carved deep by years of sorrow. "Why did you let me stay?" she asked quietly. Jedediah's eyes lifted to hers, steady as always. Because the world already tried to throw you away. And I know what that feels like. Mary Ellen swallowed hard. In his gaze she saw no mockery, no pity. Only truth. Only the weight of a man who had been broken and had chosen to stand anyway. For the first time in her life she believed she might do the same. The autumn winds grew sharper across the plains, carrying the scent of smoke from distant fires and the rustle of dying grass. Life on the ranch pressed forward with its steady rhythm, cattle to feed, fences to mend, firewood to stack high before the first snow. Mary Ellen threw herself into the work with a kind of quiet strength she had never known before. But it was Daniel who gave her purpose, who filled the long nights with soft breaths and tiny fingers curling around hers. She had never imagined herself a mother. She had been told all her life that she could not be one. Yet here she was, rocking a child to sleep under the glow of lantern light, singing softly while Jedediah sat by the fire, mending a bridle with his weathered hands. The sight of him there, broad, steady, silent, brought her a sense of safety she had never felt in her father's house. But the town did not let her be. Gossip spread like wildfire. Each time Jedediah rode in for supplies, whispers followed. Some claimed the baby was proof she had fooled everyone all along. Others muttered that she had stolen the child from some desperate woman. A few, crueler still, said the baby would bring ruin on the rancher who had taken in a cursed woman. One evening, as the fire snapped and Daniel slept in his cradle, Jedediah broke the silence. "They're talking in town," he said flatly. Mary Ellen's stomach tightened. "What are they saying?" "They say you stole him." His voice held no anger, no accusation, only the truth laid bare. Mary Ellen's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. "I didn't steal him. You know that. I found him. God knows I found him." Jedediah studied her across the table, his gaze steady. Then he said, "I know. But the truth don't always matter to people. You'll have to decide whether their words break you, or whether you break free of them." The next morning, Mary Ellen rose with the sun and worked harder than she ever had. She carried water until her back ached, split wood until her palms blistered, and still found the strength to cradle Daniel with gentleness at the end of the day. Jedediah never offered praise, but his silence carried a kind of respect. In his eyes, she was no longer the woman branded infertile. She was simply Mary Ellen, strong, enduring, alive. Winter came hard that year. Snow piled against the cabin walls, and the winds howled like wolves across the hills. For weeks, the ranch became their whole world. Mary Ellen learned to stitch blankets tighter, to stretch meals from little, to keep the fire burning when the nights grew so cold her breath frosted in the air. Daniel grew stronger, his cheeks rosy, his tiny laugh filling the cabin with a joy neither she nor Jedediah had expected to find. But spring brought more than green shoots and thawed rivers. It brought a reckoning. Word spread that a woman from a nearby county had lost her baby. Some whispered that Daniel belonged to her. Others claimed Mary Ellen had taken him to make herself appear whole. The rumors grew so loud that finally, a group of townsfolk rode out to the ranch. Mary Ellen was feeding chickens when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. Her heart leapt to her throat. Jedediah stepped out onto the porch, his rifle resting against the doorframe, his eyes cold and sharp. 5 riders approached, their faces grim. At the front was the preacher, a man with thin lips and a voice that carried weight in town. "Carter," he called, pulling his horse to a stop. "We've come about the child." Mary Ellen's arms tightened around Daniel as she stepped closer to the porch. "He was left by the creek," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I found him. I didn't steal him." The preacher's eyes narrowed. "That's not what folks are saying. There's a woman claiming you took her baby. She's grieving. She wants what's hers." Jedediah's voice cut through the air like a blade. This child was abandoned. If anyone left him to die, it was her. Mary Ellen saved him. That's the truth. The men shifted uneasily in their saddles, glancing at one another. The preacher frowned, his lips pressing tighter. "Even so, it must be settled. You can't keep him without the town's word. People won't have it." For a long moment, silence held. Then Jedediah stepped forward, his presence towering, his voice low but filled with steel. "I don't give a damn what the town will have. This child stays here. And if anyone tries to take him, they'll have to go through me." The riders muttered, uneasy. The preacher's gaze lingered on Mary Ellen, who stood trembling but unyielding. Finally, with a stiff nod, the men turned their horses and rode away, dust rising behind them. When they were gone, Mary Ellen collapsed onto the porch steps, clutching Daniel to her chest. "They'll never stop," she whispered. Jedediah knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Then let them talk. You know the truth. That's enough. But it wasn't enough, not yet. Because the whispers only grew louder, spilling into every corner of town. Some merchants refused to serve her when she came for flour or sugar. Some women turned their faces away when she walked past. Her own family sneered openly, mocking her whenever she crossed paths with them. Yet Mary Ellen did not break. She returned each day to the ranch, where Daniel's laughter filled the air, where Jedediah's steady presence stood beside her. Each slight, each cruel word, became another stone laid at the foundation of the woman she was building herself to be. And slowly something began to change. It started with the ranch hands who passed by on cattle drives. They saw Mary Ellen out in the fields, working as hard as any man, her skirts dusted with dirt, her face glowing with sweat, her child balanced on her hip. They saw her endurance, her fire, her quiet strength. And they told others. Then came the farmers. They saw how she nursed a sick calf back to health, how she bartered fairly for seed, how she offered bread to a hungry child without a second thought. They too carried word. And slowly the whispers shifted. Where once there had been scorn, there was curiosity. Where there had been mockery, there was grudging respect. The true turning came one summer evening, when a fire swept through the fields on the edge of town. The flames roared high, threatening homes and livestock alike. Men rushed with buckets, but the wind drove the fire faster than they could fight it. Mary Ellen, Daniel strapped against her back, rode into the smoke with Jedediah at her side. She carried water, hauled children out of danger, soothed frightened horses with a calm she didn't know she possessed. Her skirts caught ash, her hands blistered, but she never stopped until the flames were beaten back and the town saved. When it was over, the preacher himself came to her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wide with something like shame. "You risked your life for us," he said softly. Mary Ellen met his gaze, her voice steady. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for what was right." From that night on, the whispers changed. No one called her barren anymore. No one mocked her for the child at her side. They began to speak of her strength, of her courage, of the dignity with which she carried herself. Her family remained bitter, but their words no longer pierced her. She had built something stronger than their cruelty. She had built a life worth living. Years later, when folks told the story, they did not speak of Mary Ellen the infertile. They spoke of Mary Ellen Carter, the woman who raised a child not her own, who stood beside a scarred rancher and built a home out of nothing, who proved that worth was not measured in wombs or whispers, but in the strength of a soul unbroken. And Mary Ellen herself, sitting on the porch with Daniel grown strong and tall beside her, with Jedediah's steady hand resting over hers, knew the truth of it. She had been thrown away as a joke. But she had come back with a child, a family, and a life that no one could take from her. She was not barren. She was not broken. She was free. The seasons turned again, and with each passing year the ranch seemed less like Jedediah's and more like theirs. Mary Ellen had come to it in shame, but now she walked its fields with pride. She knew every fence post, every trough, every calf by its markings. She had learned to mend saddles, to brand cattle, to ride hard when storms threatened to scatter the herd. Her hands were rougher than they once were, her skin browned by sun, but her spirit had grown as tall as the cottonwoods by the creek. Daniel was no longer the tiny bundle she had found by the water's edge. He had grown into a boy full of energy, chasing chickens across the yard, splashing in the creek, asking questions about every bird and stone. He clung to her skirts when she cooked, rode on Jedediah's shoulders when they went to mend fence, and filled the cabin with a laughter so pure it mended cracks none of them had known were there. But with growth came new eyes on their life. As Daniel grew, people began to wonder again about his blood. Whispers surfaced in town, questions about who his parents truly were, about whether his kin might one day come for him. Mary Ellen felt the weight of those whispers each time she rode in for supplies. She could see it in the way women eyed Daniel, some with pity, some with suspicion. Children whispered too, repeating what their parents said at the dinner table. And though Daniel was still too young to understand, Mary Ellen knew the day would come when those whispers would reach him. One evening, after Daniel had been put to bed, Mary Ellen sat at the table with Jedediah, her hands tight around a cup of coffee gone cold. "He'll ask one day," she said quietly. Jedediah looked up, his eyes steady. "And when he does?" She drew a long breath. "I'll tell him the truth, that he was left by the creek, that we found him. But I'll tell him he was never unwanted. Not here. Not in this home." Jedediah nodded, his rough hand covering hers. "That's all a boy needs to know." Still, the truth of Daniel's beginning had a way of pushing itself into their lives. That spring, a woman rode into town from a neighboring county. She was ragged, her face lined by years of hardship. She claimed she had once left a baby by a creek in desperation. She claimed she had changed and wanted him back. The rumor spread faster than wildfire. Before long, Mary Ellen and Jedediah could no longer step into town without being stopped by someone asking if Daniel was hers. The preacher, the same man who had once ridden out to accuse Mary Ellen, came to the ranch again, asking that they allow the woman to see the boy. Mary Ellen's heart nearly split in two. Daniel was hers in every way that mattered. She had fed him, nursed him, stayed awake through fevered nights, kissed his scraped knees and taught him his first words. He called her mama. But she had no papers, no proof, nothing but the bond between her heart and his. Jedediah stood beside her as the preacher spoke. His voice was calm but iron-hard. That boy stays where he belongs. He don't need ghosts coming back for him. The preacher frowned, his eyes drifting to Mary Ellen. The law might say different. You'd best be ready for that. When he left, Mary Ellen sank to her knees beside Daniel's cradle. Tears spilled freely this time, hot and heavy, wetting her hands as she clasped them in prayer. She prayed not for herself but for Daniel, that no one would tear him away, that he would never feel abandoned again. Days turned to weeks and the woman's claim was never proven. Some believed her, some doubted her, but nothing came of it. Slowly the whispers faded again, like embers cooling after a storm. But Mary Ellen had learned something from the scare. She could not hide from truth, nor could she shield Daniel forever. One day he would need to hear it from her lips, with honesty and dignity. Years passed. Daniel grew into a tall, strong boy with dark eyes that carried both fire and kindness. He helped Jedediah with the cattle, ran errands to town, and never failed to bring his mother wildflowers picked from the hills. By the time he was 10, he could ride nearly as well as Jedediah himself. And still, despite all her love, Mary Ellen felt the sharp edge of judgment. Some townsfolk had softened, but others never let her forget the name she had once been given. Barren. Infertile. Worthless. To them, raising Daniel would never be enough to wipe it away. One evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Jedediah found Mary Ellen sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "They'll never stop," she whispered. "No matter what I do. No matter how I prove myself." Jedediah studied her, his eyes steady and unflinching. "Let them talk. You can't live your life by the weight of their tongues. You've built something here. You've raised a boy into a man. You've made a home out of ashes. That's more than most of them will ever do." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. His words planted roots in her, deep and strong. The years that followed brought more trials. Harsh winters, storms that killed cattle, droughts that tested their will. But through it all, Mary Ellen and Jedediah stood side by side, and Daniel grew into the heart of their home. By the time he was 15, the whispers about his blood had dulled to a quiet hum. Folks respected him for his hard work, for the way he treated others with fairness, for the strength in his shoulders and the kindness in his eyes. He was Jedediah's boy, and he was Mary Ellen's boy, and no one dared say otherwise anymore. Then came the day Daniel asked. They were sitting by the creek, the same place she had once found him, the air thick with the hum of summer insects. He skipped stones across the water, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally he turned to her. "Mama," he said softly, "where did I come from?" Mary Ellen's heart clenched, but she did not flinch. She had known this day would come. She looked into his eyes, so full of trust, so full of need, and she spoke the truth. "I found you here, Daniel. By this very creek. Someone left you, but I took you into my arms. You were mine from the moment I touched you. Maybe not by blood, but by love. And love stronger than blood ever was." Daniel was quiet for a long time, his gaze drifting back to the water. Finally, he leaned against her, resting his head on her shoulder. "Then I don't care where I came from. You're my mama. That's all I need to know." Tears slipped down Mary Ellen's cheeks, silent but deep. In that moment, every cruel word, every sneer, every whisper of barren and useless burned away like mist in the morning sun. She had been called infertile. She had been cast aside. But here was her son, her proof that a woman's worth was not measured by what the world said she could not do. It was measured by love, by strength, by the life she had built from ashes. And from that day forward, Mary Ellen no longer feared the whispers. She had her truth, and it was stronger than any lie. Years rolled on, and Daniel grew into a man. The ranch flourished under their hands, fields green and cattle fat. Mary Ellen's hair turned silver, her hands lined with years of work, but her spirit shone brighter than ever. Jedediah, though older, remained steady at her side, his love unspoken but present in every glance, every shared silence. By the time Daniel married, folks no longer remembered Mary Ellen as the barren one. They remembered her as the woman who had stood tall when the world tried to break her, who had raised a child left for dead into a man of honor, who had built a home where none had been offered. And in the quiet evenings, sitting on the porch as the sun bled red across the horizon, Mary Ellen would watch Daniel with his own children running in the yard. She would feel Jedediah's rough hand covering hers, and she would know her story had not been one of shame but of strength. She had been sent away as a joke. But she had returned with a family, with dignity, with a legacy no cruel word could erase. Time had a way of smoothing sharp edges, but it also deepened the lines of truth. By the time Mary Ellen reached her 40s, her once youthful face had grown marked by years of wind, sun, and labor. Yet the lines were not only of hardship, they were of laughter, of pride, of nights by the fire with Daniel asleep against her shoulder, of days working beside Jedediah in silent companionship. Her beauty was no longer the kind young men measured, but the kind that lived in her eyes, in the strength of her posture, in the calmness with which she carried herself through every storm. Daniel, nearly grown, had become the heart of the ranch. His hands were broad like Jedediah's, his eyes dark like Mary Ellen's. He had a natural way with horses, breaking even the wildest colts with patience rather than cruelty. Neighbors brought him animals that others had given up on, and he returned them calm and steady. In town, people nodded with respect when he passed. No one called him the abandoned boy anymore. He was Daniel Carter, son of Jedediah and Mary Ellen. But Mary Ellen still remembered. She remembered the night they had cast her out as a joke. She remembered the shame pressed onto her shoulders, the laughter of her own kin. Though time had dulled the sting, the scar remained. One Sunday afternoon, when Daniel was 17, she rode into town with him for supplies. The streets bustled with wagons, children playing, women carrying baskets. As she stepped into the general store, she felt the old familiar hush, the way conversations quieted when she entered. It wasn't as sharp as it had once been, but it was still there. Behind the counter stood her younger sister Ruth, now a plump matron with 3 children at her side. Ruth's eyes flicked over Mary Ellen, then to Daniel. Her lips curved in a tight smile. "So this is the boy you raised," Ruth said, her tone carrying something sharp beneath its sweetness. "Funny how life turns out. You couldn't give a man children, but you found one anyway." The words stung, but Mary Ellen did not flinch. She lifted her chin, her voice calm. "I didn't find a child, Ruth. I raised a son. There's a difference." Daniel, tall beside her, caught the edge in Ruth's tone. His jaw tightened. For a moment, Mary Ellen thought he might speak, but she laid a hand gently on his arm. "Let it be," she whispered. Ruth's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. Yet when Mary Ellen and Daniel left the store, heads turned, not with scorn but with respect. People had heard her words, had seen her grace, and they carried it with them. That night, as they sat around the fire, Daniel finally spoke. "Why do you let them talk to you like that, Mama? Why don't you tell them what really happened? How they sent you away, how they laughed?" Mary Ellen's eyes glowed in the firelight. "Because anger only chains you to the past, Daniel. I'd rather live free." Those words stayed with him, just as they had stayed with her the night Jedediah first told her to let tongues wag. Truth was stronger than lies, dignity heavier than mockery. But life, even a good one, is never free from trials. One bitter winter, Jedediah fell ill. The man who had always stood steady, who had worked beside her without complaint, suddenly grew weak. His breath rattled, his strength faded, and for the first time since she had known him, Mary Ellen saw fear in his eyes. She nursed him night and day, refusing to leave his side. She made broth, pressed cool cloths against his brow, prayed silently in the dark hours of the night. Daniel helped with the cattle, shouldering the weight of the ranch while his mother tended Jedediah. Weeks passed, and though Jedediah's strength returned little by little, he never fully regained what had been lost. He grew slower, more thoughtful, his body marked by the years in ways that could not be undone. One evening, when the snow lay thick outside and the fire warmed the cabin, Jedediah reached for Mary Ellen's hand. His grip was weaker than it once was, but his eyes still held the same steady fire. "You saved me," he whispered. Mary Ellen shook her head. "No. You saved me, Jedediah. Long ago when you let me stay." His thumb brushed her hand. "I never told you how much you changed this place. You made it a home again. You gave it life. You gave me life." Her throat tightened, tears slipping down her cheeks. They had never spoken of love in grand words, never needed to. Their love was in the work, in the silence, in the way they stood together against every storm. But hearing it now in his rough voice was a gift she would carry forever. As years passed, Jedediah slowed more and more, until the ranch was almost entirely in Daniel's hands. Mary Ellen watched her son grow into a man of character, strong yet kind, proud yet humble. When he began courting a girl from town, Mary Ellen's heart swelled with joy. On the day Daniel married, Mary Ellen stood at the back of the small church, Daniel's arm linked with hers as he led her down the aisle to his bride. People watched, whispering, but this time the whispers were of admiration. She was no longer the barren one. She was the mother of the groom, the woman who had raised a boy into a man worthy of respect. As she watched Daniel and his bride exchange vows, she thought of the night she had been sent away in shame, of the laughter of her brothers, of the wagon rolling into the dark. She thought of the baby by the creek, the bundle of rags that had changed her life. And she thought of the fire, the storms, the years of struggle and triumph. When the vows were said and the couple kissed, Mary Ellen's heart felt so full she thought it might burst. She had not been given the life she thought she would have. She had been given something greater, a life she had built with her own hands, carved from cruelty into dignity, from shame into pride. After the wedding, she and Jedediah sat together on the porch, watching the young couple ride off. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "You remember that night?" Jedediah asked softly. "When they sent you here?" Mary Ellen's lips curved in a faint smile. "I remember. Did you ever think it would turn into this?" She shook her head, her eyes shining. "Never. But I thank God every day it did." Jedediah's hand found hers, rough and warm. "You were never barren, Mary Ellen. You carried more strength, more love than anyone I ever knew." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she did not hide them. She let them fall, each one a testament to the years behind her and the legacy ahead. In time, Daniel's children grew up running across the same fields, splashing in the same creek. Mary Ellen became Grandma Carter, her lap always open, her stories always ready by the fire. She told them tales of storms weathered, of coyotes in the night, of the wild beauty of the land. But she never told them of the shame she had once carried. That story belonged to her alone, and it had already been rewritten. When Jedediah passed quietly one spring morning, Mary Ellen buried him beneath the cottonwoods by the creek, the same place she had found Daniel, the same place that had given her a new life. She stood there, her children and grandchildren around her, and she felt grief, yes, but not despair. She had been loved. She had lived fully. She had turned ashes into fire. In the years that followed, people in town told her story to newcomers. They did not speak of the infertile daughter anymore. They spoke of Mary Ellen Carter, the woman who had raised a boy left for dead, who had stood with dignity when the world mocked her, who had built a family and a legacy that would outlast the whispers of any cruel tongue. And when Mary Ellen herself grew frail, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch as the sun set red across the plains, she would look out over the land, the fences she had mended, the cattle she had tended, the family she had raised, and she would smile. For she knew the truth, she had been sent away as a joke. But she had come back with more than a child. She had come back with a life. And in that life she had found freedom. The years stretched long and the seasons turned like pages in a worn book. Mary Ellen lived to see her hair turn silver, her hands grow knotted from work, and her body bend with age. Yet her spirit did not wither. She still rose each morning with the sun, even when her steps slowed. She still walked the pastures, leaning on a stick Jedediah had carved long ago. She still greeted the land as though it were a living friend, one that had tested her but also carried her. Daniel's children grew tall under her watchful eyes. They loved to sit at her feet, begging for stories of the old days. She told them of cattle drives and wild storms, of how their grandfather once stood between a wolf and his herd, of how the land could be both cruel and generous. But the story they begged for most was always the one they knew only in pieces. The story of the night she had been left at the ranch, the night she had first found Daniel by the creek. She never told it with bitterness. She told it with quiet strength, her voice steady, her eyes distant as though she still saw the shadows of the past. She told it not to shame but to teach, that dignity could grow where cruelty had been sown, that love could take root in rocky soil. And as her grandchildren listened with wide eyes, they carried the lesson in their hearts, never doubting that the woman before them was greater than any insult cast in her youth. One summer evening, when the cicadas hummed and the air smelled of cut hay, Daniel sat beside her on the porch. His hair, once black, now held streaks of gray. His hands bore the scars of ranching, yet his eyes still glowed with the same warmth they had as a boy. "Mama," he said softly, "I've been thinking. Folks in town still talk about you, you know. They don't speak of that cruel night anymore. They speak of what you built. They say your story gave others courage." Mary Ellen smiled faintly, rocking in her chair. "And what do you think of it, Daniel?" "I think they're right," he said. "I think your life turned into something bigger than just ours. You showed people that no matter how hard they try to break someone, they can't take their dignity unless you hand it over." Her eyes shimmered in the fading light. "I only did what I had to, son. I didn't set out to prove anything." Daniel shook his head gently. "That's the thing, Mama. The strongest stories are never told for pride. They're lived." His words wrapped around her like a quilt. She leaned back, letting the night settle around them. She thought of Jedediah, gone now but still present in the land, in the fences he had built, in the very soil beneath her feet. She thought of Daniel, once a bundle left to die, now a man whose children filled her home with laughter. She thought of the faces in town, some of whom had mocked her, now tipping their hats with respect when she passed. The world had changed, but not because it had chosen to. It had changed because she had refused to bend. As time wore on, her strength waned. Her hands trembled when she tried to sew, her voice softened with age. But she still sat on the porch every evening, watching the sun sink red behind the cottonwoods. Neighbors came to visit, some bringing pies, others just sitting to listen. They didn't come out of pity. They came because in her presence they felt steadier, as though her quiet dignity lent them strength of their own. One autumn, as the leaves turned brittle and gold, word reached her that her brothers, those who had sent her away, were dead. Ruth too had passed some years before. For a long time she sat alone with the news, her mind turning over memories like stones in a creek. She did not rejoice, nor did she mourn. She simply felt the weight of time. "They carried their bitterness to the grave," she murmured one evening to Daniel. "And you carried love," Daniel said, his voice firm. She nodded, her eyes distant. "That was their choice. This was mine." Not long after, as winter pressed down, Mary Ellen grew weaker. She spent more hours in her rocking chair, wrapped in quilts, watching her grandchildren play. Her breaths grew shallow, her body thinner, her hands cool even by the fire. Yet her eyes never lost their light. One night, as snow drifted against the cabin walls and the fire burned low, she called Daniel to her side. Her voice was faint but steady. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything, Mama," he said, taking her frail hand. "Promise me you'll tell them, not about the shame, not about the cruelty, but about what came after. Promise me you'll tell them we built something strong here out of nothing. That no matter what the world says, dignity is ours to keep." Daniel's throat tightened, but he nodded. "I promise." Her hand squeezed his, weak but sure. "Good. Then I can rest." And with that, she closed her eyes, her face peaceful, as though the weight she had carried all her life had finally lifted. The next day the town gathered beneath the cottonwoods by the creek, where Jedediah already lay. They lowered her gently into the earth, the sound of shovels soft against the soil. People wept openly, not out of pity but out of love. They remembered her not as the girl mocked and cast aside, but as the woman who had raised a son, built a home, and lived with dignity no one could steal. In the years that followed, her story became more than family history. It became legend. At the general store, by the fire in winter, at church socials, people told the tale of Mary Ellen Carter. They spoke of the night she was sent away, of the baby she found, of the life she carved from stone. And each time they told it, they ended not with cruelty but with triumph. Daniel carried her memory with pride. His children, and their children after them, grew up hearing her story not as one of shame but as one of honor. And long after her grave grew moss and the cabin weathered beneath the sun, her legacy lived on in every Carter who walked the land. For Mary Ellen had been sent away as a joke, mocked as barren, cast aside as worthless. But she had returned with more than a child. She had returned with a life rich in love, steeped in dignity, carved with her own hands. And in the wild, unforgiving land of the West, her name became a quiet kind of justice, whispered with respect, carried forward by those who knew her truth. She had come in chains of shame, but she stood free. She had been called barren, but she raised generations. She had been mocked as a burden, but she became a foundation. In the end, the joke was not on her. It was on those who thought they could define her worth. And as the sun set over the wide plains, painting the sky in colors of fire and gold, her story lived on, etched not in stone but in hearts, in families, in the land itself. Years slipped into decades, and the world around the Carter Ranch changed. Railroads stretched across the plains, iron horses steaming where cattle once thundered. Towns grew, schools were built, and children no longer had to ride miles just to find a book. New families came west, chasing land and promise, while old names faded into history. But one name did not fade. The name Carter, born of Jedediah's steadiness and Mary Ellen's unbreakable spirit, rooted itself deep in the soil. Daniel lived long, carrying his mother's story as a torch. He told it to his children by firelight, his voice steady, never embellishing, never softening. He told them of the night his mother was cast out, of the cruel laughter, of the long wagon ride into darkness. He told them of the baby she found, and how she chose to love when she had every reason to turn bitter. He told them of Jedediah, who offered her a place and stood by her side until his dying breath. And he told them that dignity is not given by others, nor can it be taken away. It is carried inside, and only the bearer decides its worth. As Daniel's children grew, they carried the story too. Some became ranchers, tending cattle on the same rolling pastures. Others moved into town, building businesses, teaching school, or serving in law. But no matter where they went, they carried their grandmother's legacy like a shield. When life pressed hard against them, when neighbors mocked, when hardship struck, they remembered her words. Anger chains you to the past, dignity sets you free. Generations passed. By the time Daniel's grandchildren were grown, the little log cabin had been replaced by a sturdier house, whitewashed and broad, standing on the same rise where Mary Ellen once sat in her rocker. The cottonwoods by the creek grew tall, their roots tangled deep, their branches whispering with every wind. Beneath them lay Jedediah and Mary Ellen, their graves side by side, watched over by the land they had tamed together. In town, people told her story as though it were part of the land itself. Old-timers leaned on canes by the general store and spoke of Mary Ellen Carter, the woman who came in shame and lived in honor. At schoolhouses, teachers spoke of her courage, not from books but from memory, passing her legacy into young hearts. At church, preachers spoke of her life as an example of grace under cruelty, of love stronger than pride. Even those who bore her family's blood but not her name, the descendants of her brothers and sister Ruth, told the story differently now. Their grandparents' cruelty was remembered not with pride but with regret, a stain they could not wash away. Yet when they spoke of Mary Ellen, they spoke with respect, as though she had redeemed something even in them. Time moved on as it always does. Horses gave way to automobiles, lanterns to electric lights. The wide plains grew smaller under the stretch of rail and wire. Yet on the Carter Ranch, when the evening sun painted the sky, children still played in the fields, cattle still grazed, and the old cottonwoods still whispered their song. One day, many years after Mary Ellen's death, a young girl, her great-great-granddaughter, sat at her grandmother's knee, listening to the story again. The child's eyes were wide, her braids slipping over her shoulder, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "But Grandma," she asked, "why would her family do such a thing? Why would they send her away like that?" Her grandmother sighed, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face. "Because people can be cruel, child. Sometimes they let pride and judgment blind them. Sometimes they mistake worth for what the world says, not for what a heart holds." The girl frowned. "But she didn't let it break her?" "No," her grandmother said softly. "She didn't. She turned it into something stronger. And that's why we tell her story, so you'll know that when the world tries to say you're less, you can stand tall anyway." The child leaned closer, whispering as though sharing a secret. "Was she brave?" Her grandmother smiled. "Braver than most men with guns at their sides. She was brave in the way that lasts." And in that moment, Mary Ellen lived again, through memory, through story, through the unbroken chain of dignity that stretched from her time into the lives of children who would never see her face, but would carry her name. The land itself seemed to remember. Travelers passing through the valley sometimes spoke of the Carter place as different from others, touched with something unseen. They said the air felt thicker with history, that the cottonwoods seemed to stand taller, as though guarding a secret. Those who knew the story smiled and nodded. The land held her, yes, but more than that, the land bore witness to her strength. Years rolled into nearly a century since that night she was sent away. The world had changed beyond what Mary Ellen could have imagined. Yet when folks gathered for town festivals or funerals, her name was still spoken. Not with pity. Not with laughter. With reverence. Because Mary Ellen Carter had been more than a woman who endured shame. She had been proof that no cruel act, no harsh word, no unjust judgment could strip a soul of its dignity if it chose to hold fast. She had been proof that love could be found in the unlikeliest places. A baby by a creek, a stern rancher with a quiet heart, a life built from ashes. Her grave beneath the cottonwoods never stood alone. Flowers were left often, Wildflowers in spring, wheat stalks in summer, branches of golden leaves in fall. People left them not just out of duty but out of gratitude. For her story was theirs too, woven into the fabric of the land they all called home. And so, though her body rested beneath the soil, her spirit lived on in every child who grew up hearing her tale, in every woman who lifted her chin when mocked, in every man who chose kindness over cruelty. She had been sent away as a joke. But she returned with a child. And from that child grew generations, from those generations a legacy, from that legacy a story told and retold until it was no longer just Mary Ellen's, but a part of them all. On quiet nights, when the wind rustled the cottonwoods and the stars stretched endless above the plains, her descendants sometimes swore they could almost see her rocking chair on the porch, her figure outlined in the dusk, watching over them still. And maybe they did. For some spirits are too strong to fade, too rooted in the land, too woven into the fabric of love and dignity to ever be gone. Mary Ellen Carter was one of them. And long after laughter had died, after shame had turned to dust, her story remained, a testament to the truth that no one, no matter how cruel, could write the final word of her life. She had done that herself.